Hey, hello everybody, and welcome to this webinar. We've come here today to talk all about how to modernize your software architecture whilst keeping your current customers engaged and happy. So my name is Charlie Wyman, and I just want to extend a huge warm welcome to you to this webinar. It's a different style of webinar than you're possibly used to in the past. It's not going to be a death by PowerPoint. We're not going to hit you with lots of slides with lots of information. It's going to be a engaging, interactive style webinar where questions are encouraged. So if at any point that you have a question or a comment or something that you want to discuss, you can either post it in the chat or you can use the Q&A function. If you prefer to keep it anonymous, that's absolutely fine. The chat is more public, but the Q&A can be anonymized if that's what you prefer to do. So huge warm welcome to this webinar. It's brought to you by Synatech, who are a software development partner based in London, UK. And I'm absolutely delighted to introduce you to our two panelists for the event today. We've got our Chief Operating Officer, Lisa Venter, who has over 20 years experience in the software development field and is also responsible for Synatech's software delivery guarantee, because since 2019, since Lisa joined us, we have not missed a deadline or run over budget for a single project. And Lisa knows a huge amount about delivering projects and keeping things on track, as well as keeping customers happy. Also delighted to introduce you to Andrew Settle, who is our head of development. And Andrew also has over 20 years experience leading software projects and delivering software that makes a difference. So thank you, Lisa and Andrew, for joining us here today. And if you do have any questions for either Lisa or Andrew, please pop it in the Q&A or pop it in the chat, and we'd be absolutely happy to answer that for you as we go through. Welcome. Okay. Hiya. So first of all, because it's an interactive webinar and audience participation is encouraged, it's not essential, but it is encouraged. I want to ask you, what has been or what is your current challenge right now when it comes to modernizing your existing software architecture? Pop it in the chat or pop it in the Q&A. Let us know, because it'd just be good to have just an understanding of where everybody's at that's here today. Okay, so we've got one thing coming through so far. I've got my code base is currently unmanageable and the team is overwhelmed. What would be the first step to making a plan to move forwards? Absolutely, we're definitely going to cover that today. Is anybody else willing to share what your current challenge is? Don't be shy. There's no such thing as an embarrassing statement, an embarrassing question, or a stupid question. And also, if you do have a question and you have the courage to ask it, I can guarantee that there will be somebody else that has that same question that just isn't quite prepared to ask it just yet. So don't be afraid to ask. Okay, we seem to have a quiet bunch today, which is no problem at all. So maybe we just need to get started and get the conversation going to draw out some of these questions and to be able to help you. Oh, we've got one more coming through. So security is our customers' biggest priority, and they're very much against moving to the cloud. We don't want to lose our best customers. Is it possible to do both? It's a really important challenge and something that we hear about quite a lot as well. Okay, so it looks like the chat function isn't working. So I will have a look at that once we get going. But it should do that. If you go into the chat, you can send a message to hosts and panelists, or you can broadcast to everybody. But if the chat is not working for you, please just use the Q&A. Okay. But the one thing before we get going as well, that I just want to point out is that when it comes to modernizing your software architecture, you know, there are a lot of businesses that are looking to grow the business, expand into new markets, just attract more customers, be able to retain more customers. And, you know, there's a real sort of myth or misunderstanding that in order to modernize your software architecture, you need to completely start from scratch, which means alienating your existing customers. And it is possible to do both, but when you have the right plan and you're making the right steps forward, then you can keep your existing customers engaged whilst moving your business forward. And the key thing to think about here is that technology is not just the solution. It's that having to work backwards from what are the business goals and looking at your technology to see how your technology can enable those business goals, instead of try to figure out how you can change the technology and find solutions within that. Okay. So first of all, just to start with, why might you want to modernize your software architecture, and what are the benefits and advantages to business? So this is a question basically both to Lisa and Andrew. Who would like to start?
So, I mean, I'll jump in first if you don't mind, Andrew. But a lot of our customers know that they want to modernize for business reasons. So I'm glad you brought that up earlier, Charlie, because it's expansion to new markets. It could be to facilitate features quicker, or reach new businesses, or increase customer retention. So there's loads of reasons why you'd want to do it. Sometimes the architecture is old and sluggish. Therefore, when you want to add some new funky features on top, it's hard, it doesn't perform as expected, and it slows down the whole system. Or could also be that deployments are a problem, they're getting longer and longer to deploy. So, you know, those kinds of business reasons are why customers generally then decide, all right, I'm going to have to look at modernizing or doing it better. I don't know if you want to jump in, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, I think funky new features is what everybody wants, but I think, you know, if you go back to one of those questions we got in the chat there about the code base being unmanageable, I guess that's a starting point for a lot of companies about where they get to this point where they feel they can't really do anything with their current code base. And I guess the question is, what do we mean by unmanageable code? And I think our experience tends to suggest that comes from a couple of areas. So the biggest probably is that it was built 5-10 years ago using a technology, a language, which has dropped out of favor right now. And so the pool of developers that's available is quite small, and as the team therefore can't really kind of grow to it. And the other aspect is that because it's been built over a long period of time, compromises continually get made when new pieces of code do get added, and that technical debt grows over time, and it builds up into a point where you know, the rather unfavorable description is that it just becomes a big ball of mud. And it's very difficult to separate out and do new features on it because everything is very high risk. You know, a lot of code that was developed even 5 years ago has no tests built into the code. So, you know, adding a new feature which requires you to change an underlying piece of code can often be a very high risk sort of thing for companies to do. And, you know, they make that change and they miss the whole thing that somebody else was dependent on. And then they find themselves with a much bigger problem. So I think that's where they get to this stage where the code is just unmanageable and they can't really work out how to move forwards. And yeah, they want those funky new features.
Funky new features. I've heard that pop up quite a lot, quite a lot when it comes through. We've had a couple more challenges that have been shared in the chat here as well, which kind of like lead on to that as well. Somebody has commented saying maintaining a balance of new versus old and changing the culture from weekend solutions, and then adding to tech debt in brackets to solid engineering practices, slowing down to speed up and using data to help justify the bottom up technical teams requirements versus top down functional business needs. We've also had two more. Biggest challenge, getting leadership to agree to modernize even when it's clear that time to develop a simple feature has gone from short in time to extremely long. And then I think we've got a question as well saying, is there an exact methodology to follow when transitioning from an older tech or code base to a modern one? I think that's quite an interesting one, because the company that I've worked for years and years ago, you know, drawing on what Andrew just said there as well, like they had a piece of software that they were selling to companies. It wasn't cloud-based, and it was developed originally by 2 people and then continually developed by 1 person. And then that person decided to leave the business. So then the decision was made that they were going to modernize it and change things. So there were lots of different options available when deciding to modernize. So I guess, shall we talk about what are the options available if you decide to modernize? What can you do?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question really depends on the current code base and how it's utilized by people. But I think most companies that we speak to, they're in a position that they can't really switch off the existing code base. So they have to work out how to modernize, so it's essentially working on a live system to modernize it. I think there's a few different techniques. There's some great examples of how you can modernize, and usually it's around trying to find a way to start adding new features using a new code and using proxy tools effectively to mean that replaces what your existing code was doing, and you build it up over a period of time so that you gradually rebuild the application rather than trying to rebuild everything before you start doing anything new, because obviously that runs the risk that you spend an awful long time doing something. And oddly enough, developers don't like building the same thing over again. Quite often they like to build those new features. So it also can tend to mean a project that just gets weighed down in its complexity and actually leads to a lot of failure because people just get bored with doing the project and it never goes anywhere, and the company doesn't see any new features, so they see no ROI from all that work that's gone into it. So I think the strategies around creating, as I say, some form of proxy that starts to build the new application around what was there and gradually replace the features, it would probably be the sort of top of our list. But there are different techniques. It depends on the access to the underlying technology, it depends on the access to the code, because of course, in your example you just expressed there, it's possible that the original source code gets lost somewhere along the way, and that adds all kinds of extra complexity. But these things can be dealt with. It's just a question of where the code is sitting and what the state of it is, and if it's still functional right now.
Yeah, I think also, Andrew, you've hit on something there, because I think what's quite important as well is, while you're technically trying to solve the problem, you need to look at what's going to keep the business going forward as well. So if possible, prioritize the business side of things and then match the technical with that. So start with something, for instance, that could take you that step forward. Instead of saying, let me plan this whole thing out and we're going to say, big bang approach, here it is. Start with areas that are going to help you move that bit forward and then plan that out.
I guess that comes down to one of the comments that was made in the Q&A just about slowing down to speed up. Is that like taking, sort of a step out of the business and having a look at, what are your real priorities? What are the most urgent things that you need to look at first? Yes. And then spending that time to create the plan before you then start going in, trying to fix things and trying to
absolutely
move things forward.
What it also helps you do is, eat the elephant, because you then start prioritizing things based on business. And it just helps you start logically planning things. Although there are, technically you may be guided down a path when A has to happen before B. But that's all fine as long as the technical team knows what the business outcome needs to be. They can work towards that. And you can do incremental delivery to get you to that point. Yes, it'll take longer, but in that way, it's an advantage of taking current staff with you on the journey as well as, you could always accelerate development in certain areas, etc.
So from what you're saying, that if you can have an incremental way of releasing things, and also you have that plan to start with, then that helps you also engage with those stakeholders to be able to demonstrate the return on investment and also sort of show things moving forwards, rather than kind of wait until it's that big grand reveal and you're sort of showing people what's changed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of these projects, we have a client, we worked on a project like this. They had a huge system. I mean, it was a 2-year project. So you don't want to get to the end of the 2 years and say, ta-da, here it is. And then they go, oh, but our priorities have moved on. So in that way, you are giving incremental value as you move on, but also giving the team enough time to partner with someone who knows how to do it and learn from them, and eventually, move forward with the future incremental development easily, instead of having to say, well, we've got to go through a change process, we've got to, We've got to get everyone up to speed, but they also have to do their current work. In this way, it does give you a bit more flexibility in terms of current work, future work.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's probably worth talking, we talked about stakeholders there, but obviously one of the other factors that often comes into the reasons why people want to modernize is kind of external competitive pressure. And so actually building an initiative fact means, first of all, to existing customers that you want to retain, that you've got something to demonstrate that you're actively working to produce a new product. The 2-year reveal idea means that there's nothing for that 2 years for them to see that there's genuine progress. It's just, you know, what might seem to them as empty promises in sort of the worst sense is that, yeah, we're definitely working on it. But if you're doing the gradual process, you do constantly have things you can share with them, take those existing customers on your journey. Hopefully you can also use that if you prioritize it appropriately. So you're bringing in new customers who are needing those new features as you go as well. So it's a constant business process as well in terms of retaining and gaining new business.
One of the things that we know from a lot of the neuroscience research is that uncertainty is one of the brain's most hated things. So especially if you're embarking on a really long project, especially something that's 2 years, if you're telling your customers that they're going to have to wait 2 years for something and there's a lot of uncertainty around that, whether it's with your customers or with your stakeholders, you're sort of adding in a lot of uncertainty in their minds, which can create a lot of disengagement and can, you know, mean that you're running the risk of losing them. So it may look like from your point of view, there's no specific reason that you're losing them because you're telling them that something amazing is coming. But from their point of view, there's still so much uncertainty around that they may be looking for other things and looking at ways of getting that certainty into their heads.
Yeah, also, I mean, you would probably battle to get a board to sign off a 2-year big bang, you know, where in this way, if you planned it nicely, it's not an endless thing. You can map it out and have a bit more certainty of delivery.
Yeah. Whilst there's a few comments that have been made in the Q&A, so whilst I read through those, I want to ask another question really, which is like, what is your driver? So, you know, you've all joined here for this webinar, you're keen to learn, keen to hear from what our experts are sharing, but what is your personal driver for modernising your software architecture? You know, could it be something to do with customer demand? Is it stakeholder demand? Is it you're wanting to expand to new markets? Like, what is your personal driver? Let us know, share it in the chat or share it in the Q&A. It'd be great to know. So just whilst we wait for those to come through, I'm just going to read a couple of the comments as well. So one comment is, our current customers host the software and the data themselves, and there's a lot of resistance from them to embrace a SaaS model because they feel that they're paying for a hosted service. Do you have any advice on that one? So we'll definitely come to that in a moment. And a big factor for me is talent retention and attraction. Engineers are savvy and the talent market is tough at the moment. So old and tired versus new and shiny is a big deal for a lot of engineers. And that's quite an interesting point, one that I just want to pick on now whilst we wait for the goals and the drivers to come through, because we ran a webinar specifically about talent retention and also hiring new members of the team, that if you have a project that's all about developing and implementing new features on old code, you do run the risk of losing your developers and them looking for people elsewhere. If anybody here would like a copy of that webinar recording, that we have that available, I'm more than happy to share that with you here today. But Lisa and Andrew, I don't know if you just want to pick up on that point based on your own experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I think I touched on it a little bit earlier as well, this idea that, you know, engineers, developers, they will get bored if you're doing the same old repetitive kind of code activities that they want to, most engineers I know want to learn, they want to move forward. They don't necessarily need to be on the bleeding edge kind of coding stuff, but they do want to be doing the interesting things. You know, we work a lot on the Microsoft stack, so you know, if we ask people to go back and start working on things on the .NET framework, now it usually gets a big frown from our developers. Tell them they can work on .NET 6, and they're much more interested, much more excited, because that's the newest stuff. We give them an exciting kind of project that's got lots of event-driven architecture in it, which is another of the kind of modern techniques, then again, that's something that gets them really excited and moves them forward. That's just, I think, the nature of people, and the nature of a developer is often, we see in lots of interviews when you ask people why they want to be a developer, problem solving is a big part of their answer almost always. So if you take away the ability for them to do problem solving as part of their day-to-day work because they're just doing the same old, then that will be a factor why they move on. And it is a very competitive marketplace for developers at the moment.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why, Charlie, I mentioned earlier, taking your developers on that journey, because that's part of what you want to do. You want to retain those people that know your business, that know the old system inside out, and take them on the journey to grow their skills and move forward. So that is quite an important part of it. As Andrew said, it may not be, new and shiny all through, but as they're learning and transitioning, they're continually challenged.
And I think in terms of other feedback, if you are recruiting for future developers as well, is that what learning and development opportunities are you giving to your developers and your engineers, and making it clear that, you are giving them those opportunities to learn new code, your new techniques, new tools and things like that. And that can really help with that process. Make it clear that you are embarking on change. That can be a real big driver for somebody. Which sort of is a really nice kind of transition to our next point, which is around common mistakes and common mistakes and challenges that businesses face when modernizing or embarking on a modernization project. I know Andrew and I, we've discussed resourcing issues as well, especially if you don't have a development team that have the skills to do this internally. So I suppose that's quite a good place to start as we've been talking about this.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I've dealt with clients who have tried the big bang. And of course, the big bang comes and it's not what's needed. So they have to then do add-ons, and the project just stretches. And as Andrew said earlier, you need to see value early on for business. You need to be able to start that expansion, add those new customers on, whatever your motivation is for moving to new technologies. You need to start seeing that incrementally. And then also, sometimes you want to start with the foundation first, then the system gets unstable. So there's quite a few areas there that you've just got to be careful. I think the key there is plan. Andrew, I don't know if you want to add to that, but
well, I guess part of it, we've already touched on, one of the comments in the chat, wasn't it, about going slow a little bit, was that yeah. I think one of the things that I've experienced and we've seen with some of our clients is that the dealing with the everyday requests for all those little small things actually can quite often be quite suffocating for a development team, and they don't have the space to take the step back, to think about how they make the move forward. And that's important, because if you just constantly got it on the sort of the back burner of this is the thing we need to do to replace it, again, it's another of those factors that weighs on a recruitment and retention point of view as being a kind of a bit of a negative thing for people, because they never see the progress. All they're spending their time on is doing those kind of little bug fixes. And I think, as Lisa sort of said, taking the step back, planning properly and saying, look, some of those things, they're really minor. They're not going to be affecting us for the future. Let's stop spending our time on those and invest the time to create a proper plan, and work out, is there a need for a kind of bump in resource in order to mean that you can deal with the everyday activity that has to carry on whilst you bring on, do the bulk of the work to start creating the new project, because it is going to add extra work in the short term, and that's kind of unavoidable.
Just as a recap, if anybody has any questions, any comments, any feedback on any of these points that we're speaking about, please, you can raise your hand, you can add it into the Q&A, and then we can address that as well. We just had one comment saying an excellent point. This is where data helps support the planning. How long do we spend on this noise, and how much quicker would would it be with modern tech stack, or would it go away altogether? So I'm not sure if that's a point or a question. Sorry, and it's I guess it's one of those, like, the questions that we get asked all the time is kind of like, how much is it going to cost, and how long is it going to take? And I think that kind of comes into what, you know, both Lisa and Andrew have been talking about, which is around that planning process. You know, you can either have a look and do that planning yourself within your existing team, but also you do have the option of bringing in an external perspective through a software partner, which obviously this is something that Cinetech can offer. But, you know, we're not making this a huge sales pitch, and, you know, we're not the only software development partner out there. But, you know, it is about having a look at who you can get to support you on that journey, and who can support you to make those decisions, as well as have a look at, you know, get yourself out of the weeds and have a look at it from the business goal point of view, and not just in the detail and the overwhelm that you could possibly be in right now.
Yeah, I mean, Charlie, if I can just comment about that. We do help customers do that, because I have found that sometimes you're so in the weeds into your system that you can't see how to get from A to B to C to D. And sometimes that external perspective just helps you plan better, and also bring in your key people when needed. So your team can focus on what's important here and now, and somebody like us could plan it out for you. And then you basically have a plan to follow should you want to do that. It does really help, because a lot of times we've gone into companies, their staff don't have the skills to move the software forward, but the company doesn't want to employ a whole other team to do it. So we do offer that service where we will help you do the plan and get you going. And, you know, as I said, take your staff along on the journey.
Yeah, I think one of the things when just going on to this question about the modern tech stack is that simply going to modern tech stack in itself doesn't necessarily solve the problems. In fact, it can just introduce newer problems, as Lisa said, if the staff aren't familiar with it. So I think that, again, it comes back to this sort of planning to make sure that the actual modern tech stack is implemented in, you know, using best practices, using the right way of doing it, so that you can get that speed of development, right? So it is easy to make new changes and release them safely into the code base, but doing things that perhaps weren't done the previous time the software was built, like test-driven development and having unit tests for code, so that you can make a change and you can be sure before it's hit production environment, without another human looking at it to a large extent of the time, that it's not going to cause a problem with any other part of your system. So, you know, there's a lot of those kind of areas which I think are important in doing this. It's not just about simply switching to the latest flavor of whichever programming language you're using. It is about planning it for that ability to be able to do rapid releases, freeing yourself from some of the sort of problems that the older code has caused you.
And we've had a question that's been posted saying, our current development team have limited DevOps experience. It's important for us to develop these skills. Is growing DevOps skills whilst managing current workload even possible, or would you hire DevOps specific skills within new hires?
I mean, I think DevOps is one of those terms that's starting to become a bit of a catch-all phrase for an awful lot of different things. So it depends on what you mean. But, you know, I would say in my previous company, we didn't have DevOps at the start of my time there. None of us had really done it, because, you know, Azure was still at its infancy, in fact, when we started doing it. And AWS was around, but we managed to build that over time. We gradually moved from a place where we would do manual releases. It feels scary saying that now, but to a point where we could just, you know, hit a button and we could be absolutely confident it would deploy with no downtime onto our production environment. That took a little bit of time. It took us gaining skills and experience in using Azure and using the tooling from, you know, we used Azure DevOps in that, and we used their pipelines to do all the deployments. It ran the builds for us. It did the unit testing as part of those builds. So I think you can build it over a period of time. It depends, again, it comes back to sort of business need and dependency. If you want to move quickly, then you might need to bring in a specific resource in order to help the team move to it quickly. But it is possible to kind of learn those techniques and sort of gradually bring them into the company.
Yeah, also to add on to what Andrew said, the DevOps, it doesn't have to be 100% on day one. You can start, as Andrew said, by doing smaller things to get to your end goal, and then move that route. And it does give your team, again, an opportunity to learn as they go. You just have to give them that time. So again, as Andrew has said, if you're in a hurry for it, then it's always better to get a partner to help you on your road.
And it comes back to that point about planning as well, is that if you've got that plan,
Absolutely.
you can factor in, you know, sort of upskilling and learning these new tools and features as part of the plan, rather than just something that people do as an additional extra.
Yeah.
We've had another question as well, saying like recommended techniques for capturing data. Who wants to take that, Andrew or Lisa?
I need a bit more context there.
I was just thinking the same. Capturing which data?
Okay, so it was an anonymous question. So if you'd like to add a little bit more context for Lisa and Andrew, that would be brilliant. Thank you. Whilst we just give you a couple of minutes to add the context so we can answer that fully, if we kind of just go back on to talking about common mistakes that companies are making and how to avoid them when embarking on a project like this as well. So we've talked a lot about resourcing as well. One of the other points around is underestimating how much effort is involved in replicating an existing system. Does anybody want to talk a little bit more about that point?
Yeah, I think this kind of goes back a little bit to what we said earlier, which is that, you know, the systems that you're replacing have been built up over quite a long period of time, typically, you know, certainly many years. And so whilst certainly from a business point of view on the outside, it still looks like a relatively small application, all of those changes that have gone on inside the application over time add to a lot of complexity, and the application is often a lot more complex than people assume it to be. And that seems to be where you know, where we've all tripped up at points in the past, I think, where we thought it's going to be quite simple, and it's, you know, you then find that actually as you dig into it, there are a whole load of other things that have gradually been built in over time that add just huge amounts of complexity that weren't obvious from the outset, because you're used to using it every single day. But rebuilding it, certainly rebuilding it into a modern architecture, can be quite complex and difficult to do. I think that's where, you know, that tends to lead to people just underestimating what the effort is required for it, as well as overestimating the capability of the team to be able to do that alongside existing work. I think the two things kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. Also, if your team is not used to the new technologies, etc., you know, you have to factor that in as well, because it's going to take them time. And you know, a lot of, you know, as I said before, Charlie, a lot of it is plan it out. Yes, it plan in that extra capacity as well, because things are going to take slower in the beginning, but then once the team has the knack of it and the training, they should go a bit quicker and also estimate better.
I guess that's the advantage of having somebody external to the company and external to the team help you with that planning process, because they can then sort of like challenge a lot of assumptions and make sure that you're not over or underestimating certain things.
So yes, I mean, and we had a client a few weeks ago that, you know, they thought they were on a path to doing something, modernizing in a certain way. And our team was able to come and really challenge that and turn it upside down so that their thinking completely changed and do incremental development instead of just going big bang, because they had mapped out a whole big bang approach with module rollout, etc. And the system was not usable until the end of the project, where now the system was usable incrementally. And we were able to also help them with those estimates, because it's something we've done and do.
I guess one of the challenges that I've heard mentioned since I started working with Zenatech as well is that, you know, if you're looking at a big bang rollout, and you wanted to do the grand unveil, sometimes you can't predict some of the business requirements and things that you need along the way. So if you're planning a big bang reveal at the end of it and you haven't factored in some of those changes and needs, you could sometimes miss key business requirements along the way. That right?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean,
that's true. Yeah.
That is kind of one of the principles of Agile, is that you kind of, responding to change as you go through, but you can only do that with feedback from your actual customers. So if you keep all those changes away from them, then until you hit that big bang, then you get your big bang, and it may be a good big bang or it might be a bad big bang. But
yeah, exactly.
Or
you won't know until you do that. Bang.
I think one of the areas on that's probably worth maybe touching on is because you don't have to share new features with every single customer. You can do it in a way where you share it with a limited subset of customers, so you're getting that feedback. If you want to create a kind of marketing event for a relaunch, and in fact, that's commonly done even from new versions of Windows or iOS on Apple devices. There's beta testers that are running those things for 6 months before anybody else gets to see them. So there are ways of involving people and bringing people on board to get early feedback. That doesn't mean you necessarily have to share it with your whole customer base. So you can still get your big bang, but for most people.
I mean, like I come from a marketing background, even though I do have a technical background, my expertise is normally marketing. And especially if one of your drivers is around entering new markets and being able to attract new customers, actually sort of involving your existing customer base on that journey with you, rolling out new features, getting their input, getting their buy-in. It's a really, really good way of getting some like really serious fans and advocates, not just for your business, but also for your software, so that when you're at the point of releasing this into a new market or doing a big marketing launch for your software, you've got existing testimonials and you've got people that can confidently get up and say how brilliant your software is, how usable it is. So it's a really, really good way of doing that if you are planning a big bang marketing launch or anything like that. So yeah, there's a lot of advantages in that. We have had some feedback now about the context. So recommended techniques for capturing data from the question before, saying it was related to the point about how operational noise can impact the ability to remove tech debt. Data can help justify the need for investment to go faster, either with staff or external help. Do we get the devs to fill in timesheets, 4 hours on incident resolution, 1 hour on planning, 3 hours on actual development today? And the question was, what are the recommended techniques for capturing data?
I think probably the key point that's picked up in that is that you need to make sure you do capture it in some way. And individual companies will have different priorities as to what they need, whether they need to go down to actual timesheets. But if I've seen this as a thing where the developers are continually getting interrupted and fixing little tiny things, sometimes not even really related to the code base, and that has a massive impact on their ability to be productive. So I think capturing that's happening in some shape or form is very useful in terms of proving the evidence that actually, if we don't take the step back and we don't fix properly, we're just constantly burning developer time with no actual value for the company.
Yeah.
Hopefully that answers your question. If you do have anything else that you'd like to discuss, then please add it into the Q&A, or if you'd like to pick this up offline as well, I'd be more than happy to talk to you further about this sort of in a one-to-one environment. It's always difficult sometimes in a webinar environment with back and forth like this. I'm just aware of one of our earlier questions as well, which was around here, our current customers host the software and the data themselves, and there's resistance from customers to embrace a SaaS model because they feel like they're paying for a hosted service. Do you have any advice?
Well, I guess it's one of those things that's very difficult to answer with just a very simple question. This is the downside of webinars. There's lots of upsides, but the downside is you get a very simple question. It depends on the reasons a little bit, and some of it's about some of it's about demonstrating to those existing customers that a newer SaaS model brings them much greater benefits. I mean, obviously, the main advantage to them is usually the rollout of new features. And it does take away a lot of their need to actually support the actual infrastructure behind the software, because that's taken care of by the provider of the SaaS application, or in many cases, it's even taken care of beyond the SaaS provider, because it's done by the actual hosting companies, the cloud hosting companies. So I think that's one thing, and one of the areas which I think we've looked at with some customers is how we can help them build the SaaS model whilst maintaining their existing model, so they get something that starts to become demonstrable to their existing customers, and they can use that in terms of trying to manage the change of their existing customers. But most pieces of software can be written to work either on premises or in the cloud. There are lots of advantages of going cloud first, but I think it's about trying to work out what's the need for that company and what's the demands of their clients. But I think a lot of people are now moving to cloud only, so it's going to be one of those situations where I think in a few years' time, the idea of installing a massive server on your own premises will seem really kind of quite strange.
Yeah, I mean, Charlie, the idea that Andrew brought up is you show your client the value of it. Maybe they're not ready now, but kind of start that change process in their heads as to why it's valuable to move. Because it's normally about their benefit, and is there any cost savings for them or things like that. And normally you wouldn't need the staff base that you have. And I'm not saying get rid of your staff. I'm saying you could use them in other areas, upskill them, lots of other things you could do. But also it does take away a lot of headache in terms of, so you can focus on your business and leave a company to focus on what they're good at and what turns the dial for them. The other aspect which came up a bit earlier, I seem to remember, Charlie, that you mentioned something about security, that clients are worried about security. I think it was one of the earlier questions.
Yeah, we had a question saying security is our customers' biggest priority, and they're very much against moving to the cloud. We don't want to lose our best customers.
So this is part of this whole discussion. It's actually a educational change management process that you'd have to go on, because the idea that it's less secure in the cloud, I mean, there are ways of securing it and really ring fencing things, securing things. I mean, Andrew, I don't know if you want to add in here, but there are ways of doing it in terms of how, and that we found comes up with a few customers. They're worried because their clients are worried. Where's my data going? Who has access to it? But quite frankly, there's very good ways of controlling that and making sure that governance is followed, etc. So no unauthorized access, it's secure.
Yeah, I think, I think you're right. It's more of a fear about the cloud because it appears like it's open and accessible to everybody, but in reality, that isn't the case. It's that the cloud can be every bit as secure as on premises, or like on premises can be as open as people fear the cloud is. If you don't put the right protections in place, it's going to be open. But the cloud is good at helping you most of the time to do it. If we ignore all the security releases, security incidents that have occurred over the years because people haven't secured something, they just left it public. And one of the things that I really like about a lot of the cloud environments is they also have built-in AI tools that are constantly scanning your environments and warning you about things that you haven't done properly or that you can do to improve, or new techniques that have come along or new tools that have come along to help you protect your environment. So I think there is a lot of protection that actually comes from the cloud, and I think it is a case of people getting confident and feeling confident they can move to the cloud, but I don't think security in and of itself should be a reason to not move to the cloud.
guess that kind of comes down to the, sort of the planning aspect as well. It's that like having a look at, what the business wants and also what the customers want, and making sure that any doubts, any uncertainty, especially around your customers, are met and backed up with evidence and not just hearsay. Because I think there's a lot of things, and I'm speaking from experience here, having worked with various different companies over the years. I know that one of the companies that I worked for, we had a piece of software and we used to sell to certain sectors, that there was an absolute, line drawn in, they couldn't have any piece of software and upload their data to the cloud. It was like a definitive no-no. And one of the lessons learned from that company was to not spend as much time trying to chase down that market that just wasn't ready for that particular type of software, and instead to focus their efforts on going after a market that was ready. And I guess that, I can talk about that for ages, which is down to sort of marketing and making sure that you're not trying to be everything to everybody. But that is captured a lot in the planning, and having a look at, what do you want? What does the business want? What does it need? And aligning your priorities within that.
Yeah, a key part of the discovery phase of any project should be to test some of the assumptions that are made. So if there's an assumption that we have to be on cloud because it's the cool thing to do, but there's no business evidence to back it up, then they should be challenged as part of that, and make sure that you look for the evidence, and if it's not there, then actually rethink, replan accordingly. And because you've got to, for a company, they only get value out of any work that's done if it generates a return, if customers value what the outcome is, and if those things aren't true, then you probably shouldn't be going ahead with the project in that way.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So the next section, because I'm aware that we've got sort of just over 10 minutes left. So if you do have any questions that you want to ask in this webinar, obviously you have the opportunity to come and ask us questions afterwards on more of a one-on-one environment. If you do have any questions, now is the time to publish them. But I just want to talk a little bit about like how to plan. We've talked about the importance of having a plan, but how do you create a plan that doesn't disrupt your current customers, it doesn't disrupt that business as usual? What are the steps that you need to take, and in what order?
Well, I guess you could carry out on almost with my last point, which is that actually you need to invest some time in the sort of discovery around your new project, to make sure that you plan it out appropriately, so that you look at what your existing resources are and what your demands on those resources are. Can you release some of those demands so they have some capacity, and you can then also evaluate whether, if you don't change the available capacity, maybe that'll take you 18 months, 2 years to do the project, but if you added a bit of capacity, whether that's through a company like Cinetech or by recruiting extra developers, then maybe you can shorten that timescale. And that obviously also then factors back into the whole business decision, is what's the urgency of getting new features out into the marketplace, because that largely will depend on competitive pressures or demands from your existing clients if they're looking to move away because you're not satisfying their current needs.
Also, Charlie, just to add to that, we had a client in the past that were struggling to break the system down into bite-sized modules. And I think it's quite important to be able to invest the time to do that, because you need to break it up into deliverables at some point, and taking that planning time is really important, and thinking about your business. We've had several customers, well, one or two, that have thought they've got it all bedded down, and then we have a chat with them and we start saying, but did you think about this? Isn't this more important for your customers as opposed to doing something technical in the background? So it's really important to think about your business and then break that system up in terms of that value. It's not a technical thing that the software or development department goes off and does on their own. In a recent client that we've been helping, they brought in their sales areas, consultants, etc. as well, which helps with the view of what their clients are thinking and what they're doing. So, then you focus on the right things at the right time.
guess that comes onto the point as well, is that, like, you know, what do clients want versus what do they want and are willing to pay for. If you're developing software with a view that you want to acquire new customers, you want to make sure that you're investing the time in developing modules and features and functions that meet the needs that people are willing to pay for. And again, I'm just speaking from experience that I've worked for companies that have invested significant resource and money into developing things that customers are just not willing to pay for. They want it, but it's not valuable enough for them to pay for it. And there's quite a difference in that.
Yeah, again, I would really try and follow the suggestion Andrew gave of having a small panel of customers. We had a client, one of our bigger clients, we had a rollout of the part of their system was modernized. And we had the luxury of having 5 clients on board during that process, and it really worked well. That feedback came in quick, early, and you know, it just helps keep the project focused on the right things.
So in terms of the planning, so it's like actually having a plan is the most important part of the planning.
Well, thinking.
And also I think there's a lot to be said about, you know, giving yourself that time and that space to think strategically about what is needed, and not kind of go straight into the what do you need to do about it. And also, you know, sometimes getting an external perspective doesn't mean that you're going to add lots. It's going to cost you a lot more or take a lot more time, because it can actually save you a lot of time and save you a lot of money longer term by having that input up front.
Yeah, especially if it saves you building the wrong thing.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we've just had a really curious question, so I'm going to ask that, and then I'm just going to kind of like run through some of the previous questions to make sure that we've answered them. But again, if you do have a question, please pop it in now, or if you had a question that's not been answered from before, pop it in now as well. The one that's just come in through is a question but not related to modernizing. Lisa, how do you deliver all software projects on time?
You would have heard me say this 4 or 5 times throughout this webinar. Plan, plan, and plan. So, I mean, you know, I could talk all day about that, Charlie, you know that. But having a good process for delivery, having good mechanisms in terms of getting estimates and details correct, and planning it. I know it sounds ridiculous, but those are majority of our development is done that way. We have a very strong process. We have a very strong feedback loop. And also we can most times anticipate things coming because we've spent the time, thought about it with the client, planned it out, and off we go.
I mean, I guess part of that is also just that, you know, it goes hand in hand with everything else we've said, but it's also making sure you know what success looks like.
Absolutely.
Because I think it's not necessarily about delivering a particular set of features. It's about achieving something that helps the company. And so, you know, that's part of the overall process that we're trying to do and we're trying to follow. And that's why we've been successful over the last few years.
Absolutely. And focusing on that value at all times, because all of us know how exciting it is to have something new and technical happening. And then you want to really dig in and get that right. But we forgot, you know, you forget the business value at the end of the day. So you have to take all your stakeholders on that path and journey with you. And we do that. To be honest, Charlie, you know this, because transparency is key. In our projects, the clients know at all times where we are, what's going on, you know, and in that way, we're able to get feedback continually.
And it's just an external perspective on that. Transparency is key, and I know that because I've been interviewing quite a lot of Syntex customers over the last few months, and one of the biggest pieces of feedback is around how transparent and how upfront the team have been with the projects, and also in terms of doing what you say you're going to do. I think I always find it very personally frustrating. I'm like, well, why is that a really good thing? Like, why is doing what you say you're going to do something so important that everybody needs to mention it? Why is it not a given? Yeah, I think unfortunately in all sectors, not just in software development, it seems to be, you know, you can't always take for granted that if somebody says they're going to do something, that they're actually going to do it. From an uncertainty point of view, again, having worked for a company that they had an in-house development team that they recruited with a specific skill set to redevelop the code and remodernize, they didn't work with a software partner, they did it all in-house. There was a huge amount of uncertainty, and the internal team didn't keep key stakeholders up to date with what was going on. So as it turned out, months and over a year passed when actually no value was actually delivered because there was too much uncertainty. So I think it kind of goes both ways, whether you're working with a partner, you're working with an agency, or you're working with an internal team. It's that, like, that transparency and that continual development is really, really key.
Yeah, absolutely.
As well as having a plan. So I am going to ask you all what your key takeaway has been from this, and saying have a plan is going to be cheating. I'm looking for something else.
Deeply.
So I'm just going through in terms of questions. I think we've covered quite a lot of them, but if there's anything that we haven't covered, please ask it now. So I've got one question that we haven't picked up. Edge seems to be a big opportunity. How prevalent is this? Is this a consideration in the application modernization discussion?
Assuming we're not talking about Edge the browser, then yes. Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a lot of opportunity depending on the application and the scaling of it. Some of the capabilities that are available on the Edge right now of moving the functionality, it really helps in terms of performance of applications because it's very close to the actual customer, but it is more at the more complex end of development a lot of the time. So it requires scale and volume to make it really worth doing, I think. But I think it can be really powerful for companies to move increasingly to the edge. And obviously, there's some great providers out there that are doing that. I don't know whether that answers the question or not.
But if it doesn't, please let us know. We'll be happy to sort of, again, continue that conversation further as well. And then I guess there's a question, is there an exact methodology to follow when transitioning from an older tech code base to a modern one? I think we have covered that in a roundabout way. But like Lisa, Andrew, is there a preference in terms of methodology from transitioning, or like, how would you answer that question?
I don't know that there is, because there are so many factors that you have to take into consideration around it. You know, I mean, we've sort of, you know, advocated quite largely against the big bang approach in this webinar. But, you know, if you were a company that had a huge amount of money to invest, and you could do that big bang quickly because that was what's most important for you, then maybe that's right for you. For most companies, it's not right, I think. But you know, there may be cases where that is even right. So it's around, it's all those different factors coming together. For most companies, they need to do it gradual. They need to do it over a period of time, just because they don't have the resources or the information from customers to be able to do it quickly. So I think some form of migration process is necessary in terms of gradual evolution of the product. But I don't think you can simply say that there's one size fits all in terms of what process you should follow.
So we are at 1:30. You know, I've kept Lisa and Andrew talking for just under an hour now, and I just want to take this opportunity to thank you all so much for joining us here for this webinar, and that I hope that we have answered any questions that you might have, or given you something new to think about on your journey to modernising your software architecture. If there's anything that we have spoken about here on this webinar today that you would like to talk to either Lisa or Andrew in more depth, or another member of our software development team, then please either email info@cinetech.co.uk or just reply to one of the emails that I've sent you about this webinar, and I'll be more than happy to connect you to the right person. I think one of the key things that's come out of this webinar is the importance of that plan. It is something that you can kind of go away and have a look at yourself, but if you are looking at having an external perspective or somebody to help you with that planning process, then please feel free to give us a call and we can discuss that with you. Or if this webinar has sparked any other questions that we haven't covered today, or something that pops up at a later date, again, get in touch with us. We'd be more than happy to have an absolutely no obligation call with you to discuss that moving forwards. If you're willing, it's always lovely to hear what your biggest takeaway or what your biggest learning has been from this webinar. So if you're willing to share that, please pop that. Do it in the Q&A, because I think there is some problem with the chat today. So do it in the Q&A. It'd be lovely to hear from you. If not, I wish you a wonderful rest of your day and hope to see you at one of our future webinars or events. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Lisa and Andrew.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've had a lovely comment saying learned a lot in capitals. Would love to get more info from you all. Absolutely. We can definitely set up a call and answer any questions that you've got.
Yep.
Just for anybody that is still here as well, we do regular webinars on different topics. So if there's any topic that you would like to hear more of, please let me know. So again, just reply to one of the emails that you've got about this webinar anyway, and that, you know, we can plan that in. And also we do also host virtual roundtable events. So these are invitation only events. They're limited sort of like groups of sort of 6 to 8 people, and they're held more as a meeting and a sort of general discussion rather than a sort of panel webinar with experts. So if you'd like an invite to one of those events, then please let me know, because we host those as well. Lots of stuff going on to help you with your software development journey. Alrighty, okay. If there's nothing else, I think a lot of people have left already. For those of you that are still on here, if you do have a question, please reply to that email. And if not, I hope to see you at a future event. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Bye.